Ah, the end of the year. The perfect time to stop and think about what you've learned this year. Maybe you finally learned how to make the perfect cup of coffee. Or maybe something else. Either way, let's sit down and talk about what you learned this year living in Denmark. Denmark has definitely taught us a lot this year. One thing that I noticed about myself is that I really have no patience with haggling or bartering or bargaining for price anymore. And that's something that maybe is somewhat common in different buying situations in American buying culture. And I've heard that in some parts of Denmark, like in Jylland, it's actually something that people kind of enjoy doing too. But in my daily life in Denmark, I don't ever have to do that. And it's something that getting out of that habit, I really have no patience for it anymore. And I learned this when we replaced our dining room table and sold my spisebord on Facebook Marketplace. And a few people that were interested in the table just wanted to go back and forth about the price and negotiating. And I just, I wasn't having it. I just can't do it anymore. And I think that I did end up selling it for a little bit less. I think somebody came in maybe like 200 kroner shorter than less than I wanted for the table. And I just said, yeah, fine, take it. I probably could have tried to go up another 100 kroner, but I was like, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. So if it's that important to you, you can take that 100 kroner and, go buy something else with it that's nice. You got me, because I just don't have the patience for it anymore.
Yeah, I'll be honest, this kind of suits me quite fine. I've never been one who likes that kind of bartering thing. Sometimes it's fun when you're on holiday and you're in certain places, like if you're in the Grand Bazaar in Istanbul, it's part of the fun. You go haggle back and forth over whatever you're trying to buy there. But I've never really enjoyed this part of the back and forth. In the US, it's especially true when you're trying to buy a car. I'm not sure if it's the same
especially
thing.
Cars, yeah.
I'm not sure it's the same thing in Denmark. I haven't had to buy a car in Denmark, but it's such a game back and forth where there's the sticker price, but no one pays sticker price, and you have to go in there, maybe you offer a price, and then the salesperson says he has to go talk to his boss, and they sit there and have a coffee, and you stand there for a while, so they make you feel antsy to just take whatever. It's a huge pain. In fact, there's a whole industry now in the US to have companies that negotiate for you, so you don't have to do that anymore. So this whole thing of not having to haggle and negotiate, I'm fine with that.
Yeah, so it's year 5 of living in Denmark, and I think that's just one thing that dawned on me. Y'all changed me. I just can't do it anymore.
Now, similar to that, something that I really learned this year is how much I enjoy not having a constant salesmanship for everything when we live in Denmark. Now, I think we've commented on a few videos, especially in the workplace. This is one of the key cultural differences where it's very common in the US to have to kind of sell yourself to your colleagues or manage your boss or different things like this that are not quite as common in Denmark, and I've gotten to enjoy for more than 5 years here, kind of bridging that gap between the two. Where it really showed for us is as we were doing some wedding planning this year. So I think we were doing a wedding here in Denmark. We're doing a wedding in 2023 in the US, and so we need a photographer for both. When we were trying to find a photographer for the one in the US, we had a Zoom call with this guy. He's super nice, but he had us go through and visualizing how we're going to be on that day and talking about what we love about each other, and just really trying to get us in the moments.
It was so corny. It had nothing to do with photography.
Nothing at all to do with it. And then suddenly he comes to the prices, which were exorbitantly high, and he shows off the different packages, and he's like, which one do you think you want? And then all of a sudden you could see that we're kind of like, basically taking the bottom one because it's super expensive. And he's like, oh, I'm not sure if you guys want this. I'll take 20% off, or I'll throw in an extra photographer. I'll do this. And just all of a sudden, he was just
because
trying to
I like
sell
you guys,
us.
I'll give you an extra hour.
It was just totally salesman, and it was just kind of like, I just need somebody to take pictures on the day. Contrast, in Denmark, we had to get a photographer. We found somebody that we basically just asked, have you shot in City Hall before? Yes. Okay. Are you available on blah, blah date? Yes. Okay. Practicalities. How much is it? Reasonable price. When can you show up? Reasonable time. And done. And it was a super nice experience. A really great guy. Really appreciate it. And didn't have to have kind of the sales back and forth and think about like, what did I love about Derek? That has nothing to do with a photographer.
Yeah, and I think that it really comes down to sort of a few elements here. One is basically trust. We've talked about that in a couple videos this year that have been on our channel. But I think that for me, the big thing that I lost was kind of that trust. When You're trying to tell me that you weren't giving me the best price right away? Why would I trust you then to come through and actually be good enough for me on the day of the event when I really need you? And I really appreciated that with our Danish photographer, that when we actually had a Zoom call with him, all of the discussion was about those practical details. What time do you want to shoot? What are you going to be wearing? Are we going to be outside, inside? Do you have some time to walk around City Hall before we take the photos inside, and all of that stuff? So it really, I think, comes down to that Denmark is a very high trust society, and you're not necessarily expecting people to come at you sideways with all kinds of different sales techniques. And I appreciate that a lot more. And I think that's one more part where kind of my American upbringing is slowly dissolving throughout my time living in Denmark. And I noticed that one big this year too. This year of living in Denmark, I also learned that our election system in the United States is a bit more similar than I originally thought to the way that elections and politics work in Denmark. And although the system of elections is a bit different, really the politics and the way that things ended up turning out in the elections that were held in the United States, as well as the elections that were held in Denmark, were pretty similar. What I mean by that is digging into it a little bit more and learning more about Danish elections and politics this year, I learned that really leadership of Danish government has gone back and forth between the red bloc and the blue bloc, very similar to how the Democrats and Republicans have shared leadership basically back and forth in the United States. Essentially, in Denmark, you vote for either the red bloc or the blue bloc, knowing who's going to wind up being prime minister, just like we do in the United States, knowing which party and which factions amongst the party is going to pick their candidate or their leader to be president if that party wins. And just like in Denmark, where each party that is in the majority government ends up having some influence in the laws that get passed and the policies that are put in place in Denmark, it's very similar to how different factions within the governing party in the United States has little ways of influencing the policy that's put in place in the US. This year was a little bit different in both countries, where things kind of went over the middle. And what I mean by that is that you saw a government formed in Denmark that was done between two traditionally opposing parties that are sort of more in the middle or representing a centrist part of politics. And in the United States, you had a lot of bipartisan bills that were passed in infrastructure, in marriage equality, and in technology and manufacturing that were done in a bipartisan way, with kind of ignoring the fringe or extreme elements on both the left and the right, and those congressmen and women in the middle coming together to make it happen. And the cool thing about this is that it was really forged by sort of veteran politicians, elder politicians, I don't want to call them old, but Joe Biden and Lars Løkke in respectively the US and Denmark coming together to sort of forge this idea of bipartisanship in the US or a centrist government in Denmark to kind of do something new and something a little bit different. And that's, I don't know, yet to be determined, but we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, and kind of on the politics angle too, also what we learned this year is that reality apparently follows fiction in Danish politics. This is the year that we finally got to watch Ole Born, and in doing so, we realized that 2022 is basically just season 3 of Born, where you get to have a new party come out of nowhere, led by a former states minister, and in the end, spoiler alert, it ends with them becoming the foreign minister. So kind of funny how fact follows fiction in Denmark just, 10 years after the fact. Now, speaking on the politics front as well, there's another area that I think Denmark taught a lot, and honestly, so did the US, and that's in the area of immigration integration. This is obviously a political year in both countries, having elections, so a lot of conversations happened about that. There are a lot of stories about these different areas as well. And I think one of the big takeaways for us is about how much nuance is starting to come into these conversations, where maybe it's a little bit more adversarial and you couldn't really talk about things face to face as you can now. One of the key nuances that matters for us, obviously, is we are immigrants. And obviously that means that we share an existential fear that every other immigrant to a country has, which is that you're kind of in a different home that's not necessarily yours, and it may go away at some point. And there's always this little trepidation that you have when you live that kind of life. And this is a year that I think there were a lot more stories about the human side of immigration rather than just stories about how it's numbers or people taking jobs or whatever else. And we did a story on it, obviously, with the people that are British citizens that are at risk of getting kicked out of Denmark. But there were also stories that you saw in the Danish media, particularly around situations of families perhaps getting split apart or being forced to go back to countries like Syria, that put a human side on immigration as well. And this is a really important thing because it's easy to get lost in immigration. It's just one more almost cynical ploy that politicians use to try to win votes. This is true in every country, not just in Denmark and the US. But a human face got put on that, and we hope that we can bring a little of that as well with our experience here as immigrants living in Denmark.
Yeah, and I think for me, something that kind of the immigration debate in both countries taught me this year is, I'm not coming from a place of universal sympathy, and I think that I looked at it as more black and white before I've had this experience myself. And I think that now I really see that, yes, there is very good reason for legal immigration, but that also means there's a very good reason to follow laws and have policy in place. And you can do that, and you must do that in a humane way, which is really tricky to do. And that there's really a human side to that. As we've gone through the experience of living in another country, and as it's become something that was at first just a temporary business move to now we want to and we are staying in Denmark, hopefully indefinitely, it's kind of opened up my eyes to sort of both sides of this argument. And I'm starting to see things, and I've kind of maybe been taught this year that it's a little more than a black and white issue. There's a lot of middle ground there.
Yeah, and I think a challenge is that in some ways you only really understand that when you go through the experience. And I think that's one where maybe an ask for some empathy and understanding on this can help make it so that we can have a better way to have these sorts of debates going forward.
Another cool thing that we learned while living in Denmark this year is that Denmark is actually one of the easiest places and one of the most popular places for people to have destination weddings. Now, it's not necessarily like getting married in, say, the Caribbean and inviting your whole family. A lot of Americans do that, and maybe even people from Europe and around the world as well. But Denmark actually makes it very easy for people from foreign countries to get married within Denmark. And if you want to talk about nice white sand beaches and other great backgrounds, castles and other places where you can get married, Denmark is full of them. And maybe that's something I didn't know until we started planning our own wedding in Denmark this year, that it's become a huge place for people to go to get married. Partly because it's so easy and partly because it's so beautiful.
Yeah, I think for us too, it's special because it's obviously the place where the first same-sex union happened. So it's a nice piece of coming full circle, I think, for us as in a relationship too, to get to share that moment and see a little piece of that important piece of human history that happened in 1989 and is able to continue through us here.
Yeah, and if you want to get to know a little bit more about getting married in Denmark, a little bit about, like Mike said, the first same-sex union that happened in Denmark, you can watch this video right here and even watch us get married and see some pictures from our special day that happened in Denmark this year. So thanks a lot for watching, hearing a little bit about what we learned this year in Denmark, and hi.
Hi.
Good new tour.